Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to our channel and thanks for logging on. Today we are flying with a legend. It is the ageless Omega Speedmaster Professional Moonwatch. This, its latest iteration, its latest reference, the current model for sale on Omega's website. We're going to take a look at this latest iteration of a long-running legend, talk about the elements that are timeless, the elements that are more recent, and give a basic wrist impression and functional appraisal of a watch that might be the most discussed co-equally with Rolex's Submariner on the entirety of the internet. Now, the watch on my wrist can be seen and purchased on our website. Subscribe to our YouTube channel if you enjoy these videos, and please click on the card in the upper right hand corner of the screen at any time during this video to see our full sales listing for this watch, with additional accessories included in the sale, high resolution images for your desktop, and naturally complete pricing details for this Omega Speedmaster Professional Moonwatch. Now, you'll also note that I've changed my video settings a bit, and I've moved the camera further away from my wrist to give a better sense of how the watch sits on my wrist, with my wrist better taken into account as part of my entire arm, so proportionally you're going to get a better idea of the watch's size and stance. Now, my wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference, so you can see that the watch, 42 millimeters across the 9:3 measurement, not including crown and crown pushers, was almost obnoxiously huge by the standards of the 1960s. Now, the watch became the Professional in 1965, and shortly thereafter it gained the asymmetrical beveled case that you see here, whereby the crown and the pushers are somewhat countersunk. It measures a true 42 across the wrist from 3 to 9, and then in terms of thickness, it's slimmer than I remembered, being 14.3 despite the towering acrylic or hesselite crystal, as Omega likes to call it. You'll also note that there's dramatic flare to the tachymeter bezel, so this can get caught on tight dress cuffs. Even though 14 1/3 is not thick by modern sports watch standards, it's the specific shape of the overhang of the tack that can cause this watch to get caught up on a dress sleeve, but it has no difficulty sliding beneath the cuff of a blazer, a sport jacket, or a suit jacket. A couple of different ways to measure this watch from lug to lug, because it does come with an extraordinary boxed set, which is wonderfully themed and rich in its accessories. I want to clarify that the watch has a 20 millimeter lug spacing, which means it takes 20 millimeter straps if you choose to put it on the OEM NATO strap that comes with it, or order an aftermarket to better suit or tailor the style of the watch. From lug to lug, if you were to measure just the lugs, again, as you would wear it on a strap, the watch measures 48.5 millimeters horizontally across the wrist. Now, this is where it differs from the historic examples. It's a solid end-link bracelet. This bracelet's going to surprise in a couple of ways compared to historic examples, and those solid end links extend the watch across the wrist to 53.6 millimeters, so it's a substantial timepiece. With the bracelet on, it almost wears as large as something like a 44 millimeter Panerai Luminor with the traditional Betterini case. Now, the watch is not excessively hefty, though it certainly has a little bit more solidity about it in both the amount of material and the quality of the material used to compose the bracelet. Now, the bracelet features no tapering. It's a straight shot down from the lugs, but you'll notice that Omega does finish it nicely. It is a little bit more supple than something like Rolex's 3-link Oyster, with which it shares a superficial similarity. This features somewhat narrower links that are more dramatically concave on their backside, so that it does feel almost more like a Rolex Jubilee than the Rolex Oyster on the wrist. That's the sensation of wearing it. You'll note that this is a bracelet that will aerate your wrist on a hot day. It has plenty of calculated gaps to let heat, sweat, moisture, and grit escape. It also features those recesses between the links to avoid pinching skin or pulling hair. Once again, we talk about improvements over the past. The combination of the polished flanks, the satin shoulders, and then the intermediate links down the center with both polish and satin finish is handsome and gives the watch almost a dress aesthetic by the standards of modern big and boisterous sports watches. You can see, once again, upgrades. It does pay to buy the latest. Screws for sizing adjustment, so this is something that NASA astronauts of the 60s likely never would have imagined, nor would they have imagined the trigger-actuated, fully milled-out, almost monoblock clasp. It has a solidity that inspires immense confidence, but also impresses. This is not a very expensive watch, retailing for right around $6,000 This is a timepiece that feels more expensive than it is. Despite the march of years, Omega's classic has stayed young by virtue of the fact that it's simply well made and getting more so with time. So this clasp, a modern piece matched to a modern bracelet, and of course screws used for sizing. I may as well make a little bit of fun of Patek Philippe with the Nautilus and its pins and sleeves bracelet since 2012. Now Patek says that it does that so that the screws don't back up and become loose or release the links unintentionally. Well, let me think. Screws and links floating around in space. What's the worst that can happen? Do I sense that this, and not Patek's, is the optimal arrangement? No comment. Now, the watch itself hasn't changed much. This is the aesthetic that astronauts, enthusiasts, chronograph connoisseurs, and even race car drivers and motorsports fans came to know during the 1960s. It was essentially set in stone by the late 60s, with very little changing in the time since, save for the transition from tritium to superluminova. The dial is matte black, so it has a slightly pebbly grain about it if you look at it under a loupe. Of course, all features of the dial are, in my opinion, enhanced, not distorted, by the fact that the watch has that gorgeous off-axis distortion born of the plexiglass. Now, the distortion is charming rather than disruptive. You got to be looking at it at a wacky angle to get any kind of distortion of any calibrations, subregisters, or radial. I'll also mention that the watch still features its anodized aluminum tachymeter for timing things that, based on the calibration of 500 units, move very, very quickly indeed. The timepiece features a no-nonsense, simple white-on-black printing. The hands, at least their luminescent points, and the plots for the indices do have a slight lime green tinge to them. Rather than detracting, though, it adds a little bit of color and character to the dial. As ever, the subregisters, which I'm going to try to demonstrate here, do have a little bit of a countersink. They're somewhat recessed within the plane of the dial just to break up their aesthetic, add another plane of focus, and frankly make the watch look a little bit more upscale and refined. So the watch has a tried and true caliber in here. By the way, stick around for the end of the video. I'm going to do a lume shot with this watch. A tried and true caliber. You know it, we love it. It's the Omega 1861. It's based on the Lemania 1873 Bausch. This has been the setup since roughly mid-1968. With changes, the 1861 became, or the 861 became the 1861. The original 321 column wheel was different in a few respects, but principally in that it beat at 18,000 vibrations per hour rather than 21,600 vibrations per hour. With its column wheel architecture and its more vintage specification, it was also a little bit less accurate and, truth be told, a little bit less durable. Yes, it's true that it's easier to make a cam chronograph. They're also a heck of a lot tougher. And I've actually heard it said that this watch, the original Moonwatch, is tougher with respect to concussion and impact resistance than the later X33. So a tough watch, not the most water resistant at 50 meters, but again, since this is the most recent reference and a fairly recent manufacture, it's sufficient for surface swimming and exposure. I just wouldn't want to take it scuba diving, snorkeling, or in any kind of high impact situation like wiping out on water skis or a jet ski. Nevertheless, it is a tough timepiece, and one of the advantages of the acrylic is that although it can scratch a little bit more easily, that's easily buffed out with a abrasive like a pencil eraser, and it's very, very difficult to shatter outright. That's why this older reference maintains the Hesalite crystal rather than a scratch-resistant sapphire. It's simply safer for use in actual extra atmospheric activity. So the watch is still certified for use by NASA, both for use on the International Space Station and U.S. space vehicles, but also for extravehicular activity where you actually go outside the craft. The watch remains a frontline piece of issue for NASA astronauts, even as it's a little bit of a vintage treat for collectors now. The 1861 movement beats away at 21,600 vibrations per hour. It went from a 17 to an 18 joule in approximately 1993, and it's been steady ever since. Brass with rhodium-coated bridges, it has a manually wound 48-hour power reserve, and in addition to the cam system, or shuttle system for selecting the function of the watch, it uses a traditional lateral clutch, the two systems being very, very, very robust. And because this is important to me, I want to specify that the watch is a pleasure to wind. A manually wound watch should be a pleasure to wind, and sure enough, this one is. So the tactile pleasure of using the watch is such that you could have fooled me if you told me there was a column wheel in this case. With the manufacturing tolerances of modern Omega and Lemania products, it's indistinguishable. You hear it, you feel it, it's sharp, it's impressive, it winds, it starts, it stops, and it resets beautifully. See this all-timer and buy it on our website. Omega Speedmaster Professional Moonwatch. No longer tritium, that's long gone. Today we use luminova. And of course, the watch has a brilliant and blistering display. While you can't see chronograph minutes or hours, you can see the chronograph seconds hand. Absolutely dazzling day or night, this all-timer can be seen and purchased on our website.